All right, let's jump right into this explainer and explore how a completely devastating 17th century peace treaty accidentally invented the modern concept of the country. You know, it's a concept so deeply ingrained in our daily lives today that we hardly ever stop to think about where it actually came from. We're going to unpack the treaties of 1648, broadly known as the Peace of Westphalia, and see exactly how a really desperate attempt to end an apocalyptic war gave birth to the international system of sovereign states that we are all still living in right now.
So I want you to start by asking yourself a super fundamental question. Why do borders even exist? I mean, when you look at a globe, why are there these strict, invisible lines separating entirely different legal realities? And maybe more importantly, why is it basically a universal rule that countries tell each other to mind their own business when it comes to internal affairs? We totally take things like passports, defined borders, and national sovereignty for granted. But as we're about to see, this absolutely was not the default setting for human civilization.
Section 1. Europe in Chaos.
To figure out how we got our modern borders, we literally have to travel back to an era of apocalyptic devastation, where overlapping religious and imperial authorities plunged Europe into absolute, utter chaos. The sheer exhaustion of this era is hard to overstate. Decades of overlapping conflicts just created immense destruction and economic ruin across Central Europe. Back in 1568, you have the start of the 80 Years' War, which was Spain's long, really bloody struggle to suppress Dutch independence. Then, parallel to that, we hit 1618. Protestant nobles revolt against Catholic Habsburg rule in an event known as the Defenestration of Prague, where, fun fact, they quite literally threw government representatives out of a window, and that sparks the catastrophic 30 Years' War. By the time we reach the 1640s, the continent is gripped by widespread famine, unimaginable destruction, and total, complete war exhaustion. All parties were pushed to the absolute brink of collapse.
Now, the battle lines here were incredibly complicated. On one side, you had the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, along with the Holy Roman Empire, and they were attempting to centralize power and impose Catholic uniformity all across the German states. But on the opposing side, you had a coalition of Protestant princes, alongside major rival powers like France and Sweden. And what began as a localized religious struggle inside the Holy Roman Empire quickly evolved into something else entirely. France and Sweden stepped in not necessarily out of some deep religious devotion, but because they deeply feared total Habsburg dominance in Europe. So the conflict escalated from local Protestant nobles revolting against Catholic rule into this massive continental power struggle fueled by really messy, overlapping feudal loyalties.
Which brings us to Section 2, Forging the Peace.
By the 1640s, the warring parties were just so desperate for survival that they traveled to the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück to negotiate a settlement. And the absolutely crucial point here is that they didn't just impose a singular law, they created a whole new framework for coexistence. Up until this point in history, ending a conflict usually meant one side just entirely conquering the other. But the sheer scale of the devastation forced a total change in tactics. Representatives gathered for what basically became the very first modern diplomatic congress. They were creating a brand new precedent, resolving international conflicts through organized negotiation rather than solely through continuous, grinding warfare. They gathered to literally stop the bleeding.
And that leads right into Section 3, the new rules.
To actually achieve this peace, they had to create entirely new rules of the game. They had to fundamentally shift how global authority worked. Because the conflict was sparked by religious divisions following the Protestant Reformation, they tackled religion first. They looked back to an older, really fragile agreement from 1555 and reaffirmed this Latin principle, cuius regio ius religio, meaning whose realm, his religion. In plain terms, it established that the local ruler of a state had the right to determine the official religion of their own territory, completely free from the dictates of an overarching emperor. But this time around, they added a seriously innovative twist to ensure the peace actually lasted.
The treaty officially recognized Calvinism right alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism, finally correcting a major flaw of past agreements. And perhaps most radically, the Pope's ability to intervene in the internal political or religious business of these states was effectively ended. No way that happens a century earlier. And crucially, they offered vital protections for religious minorities, allowing them to practice their faith in private even if it wasn't the official religion of their ruler. They were finally putting a lasting bandage on the religious tensions that sparked the whole war in the first place.
And the rapid-fire territorial adjustments were huge, deciding exactly who walked away from the negotiating table with what. France gained parts of Alsace, solidifying its influence on the continent. Sweden received critical territories along the Baltic coast, which elevated it to a dominant regional power. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic, after 80 grueling years of struggle, was finally formally recognized as an independent, sovereign nation. Switzerland, too, was confirmed as completely independent from the Holy Roman Empire. These weren't just arbitrary lines drawn on a map anymore. This was the solidification of hard borders and newfound independence.
We are looking at the ultimate paradigm shift here. On one side, you have medieval Christendom, this messy web of overlapping feudal loyalties where papal authority and religious motives drove politics. But on the other side, we have the birth of the Westphalian system. This replaced that medieval idea of a unified Christendom with a system of genuinely independent states. Boom. We now have clearly defined borders, state sovereignty, and secular national interests taking the wheel. Rulers held supreme authority within their own hard borders.
Section 4. The Westphalian Legacy.
That brings us to the actual matrix of modern international relations, the world we still live within today. Central to this legacy is the concept of raison d'etat, or the national interest. By stripping the Church of its supranational role as the ultimate arbiter of European politics, international relations became completely secularized. Foreign policy wasn't primarily driven by religious affiliation or divine mandates anymore. Instead, the decisions of a state became driven purely by what was in its own best secular, strategic, and economic interest.
And this secularization paved the way for three massive pillars that shape our entire world today. Step 1, the sovereign nation-state, meaning a state has exclusive authority over its own internal affairs. Step 2, the legal equality of states. Whether you are a massive empire or a tiny republic, regardless of your military power or your religion, you are legally equal on the world stage. And Step 3, strict non-intervention. That's the foundational norm that one state should not meddle in the domestic affairs of another. So whenever a modern politician says, mind your own business to another country, they are directly invoking these three Westphalian pillars. They literally form the basis of the UN Charter today.
Furthermore, to keep the peace going forward, they institutionalized the balance of power, ensuring that no single nation could ever become too dominant again. The treaty firmly established that European stability depended heavily on preventing any monopolies of power. The Habsburgs' influence was severely curtailed, while France emerged as a stronger continental power, kind of keeping each other in check. This incredibly pragmatic approach created the very bedrock for modern international law, established norms for diplomatic community, and shaped global diplomacy for centuries to come.
But I'm going to leave you with this final, really provocative thought to consider. The term Westphalian sovereignty is still used all the time to describe our world order of defined borders and non-intervention. However, in our deeply interconnected modern era, an era defined by rapid globalization, international human rights law, and the rising norm of humanitarian intervention, we have to ask, can this 400-year-old idea of strict non-interference truly survive? When crises cross borders so easily today, does the 1648 definition of a country still hold up? It's a massive, fascinating question, and understanding the origins of these borders is the absolute first step to answering it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the map.